Hi, I'm Baldur Brönnimann, and this is the Conducting Coaching Podcast, where we talk about conducting from the inside. Hi, and welcome back. I hope you all had a good week. Now, this week we'll talk about something that will accompany us conductors during our whole careers, which is the issue of nonverbal communication. When you're conducting, there's a constant flow of information between you and the musicians. You transmit information, but you also receive information from people when they play, in rehearsals and concerts. And I think as conductors, it's very important to look at how this transmission really works. Because then we can use our communication in a conscious way, we can use it in a more effective way, and we can also work on the way how we communicate with our players. And that's what we're going to do today. Research has shown that in a normal conversation, 7% of the meaning is conveyed with words. 38% is conveyed with the tone of your voice, and 55% of the meaning is conveyed with body language. Now, I would say in a musical rehearsal, these numbers would be even more extreme. The amount of information you convey just simply using words would be much smaller, and that's a good thing. Talking in rehearsal is an emergency measure. It means there are things that you can't express in another way. You have to stop and say. But I still see especially young conductors who try to explain absolutely everything, even though words fall really short if you want to express musical facts. Musical information very often relates much better to nonverbal communication than to verbal information. There are certain things that you have to express in words. You can't conduct intonation non-verbally, or you can't conduct the right notes instead of the wrong notes. But these things that you have to express in words are just a really small part of all the things you want to express when you make music together. But in conducting education, usually the focus is on conducting technique, which is a type of language that you have to learn and then use in a conscious way, and on words describing musical facts. But looking at the 7, 38, 55 statistics, it's exactly the rest, all the kind of communication you use in a non-conscious way that carries most of the information. The tone of your voice, and especially your non-verbal physical expression. Words and conducting technique are languages that have to be learned first in order to be understood and used. But today we'll look at all the rest, all these kind of signals that we instinctively understand and use because they're part of our genetic heritage. Charles Darwin was one of the first to talk about nonverbal communication and evolution. He showed how animals communicated via eye contact or via facial expressions. They communicated fear or other emotions that spoke to other animals on an instinctive level. He also showed how nonverbal language helped certain species to survive because it allowed them to communicate better. Now, this is just to demonstrate that nonverbal communication is at the very root of our existence. It's a very primal language. It's something that we know much before we learn how to use words, for example. Babies start communicating a long time before they start learning words. And this sort of primal instinctive language is something that is very important when we talk about conducting. Babies, of course, use this kind of communication in an unconscious way, and we often do the same. Most of the information we send out is via very small, minute, and sometimes irrecognizable gestures that we don't actively control. Especially eye movements or facial gestures are usually sent and received in an unconscious way. But they are much more expressive or efficient in communicating emotions or a state of mind than words could ever do. As conductors, we have to use this kind of information in a conscious way. We already talked about this when we talked about the Stanislavski method in episode 4. The Stanislavski method is a way to turn memory or emotion into physical expression. But today we'll look at how this transmission of feelings and of information exactly works. And analyzing this, you will hopefully take away some knowledge that you can then use to improve your communication when you're conducting. Now, what sort of types of signals can you send out when we're talking about nonverbal communication? We talked about conducting technique. This would be the gestures category, kinetics. This is something that has to be learned, as we said. Maybe you can compare this to an army salute, or maybe a thumbs up, or just sort of gestures that are universally understood. And the same, of course, goes for musicians. Musicians will be trained to understand what a downbeat means, what a cue is, what it means to cut off a fermata, and you in your conducting education will learn how to use these type of gestures in the best and most effective way. But there are other categories like facial expressions. For example, we talked about this too. There's some facial expressions that you can steer a bit more consciously, like a smile, for example, and some others that will come automatically related to a certain emotion or something that goes on in your brain. The same goes for body language, posture, for example. There are certain elements of body language that you can control and use in a more conscious way, and others that are just simply more linked to your state of mind or to what's going on inside of you. Then there are things like eye movements. Now, eye movements you can't really train in a very conscious way. The only thing there to do is to find out how they are related to your emotions, and then work on your emotions or what you want to communicate rather than how to communicate it, because this is something that doesn't sort of relate to conscientious action. Then there is your appearance, of course, your clothes, the way you dress, that say something about you, but also that allow you to communicate in a certain way. For example, I often tell my students to dress quite neutral or dark in order for your hands to be seen very clearly in front of your clothes, or the baton to be seen very clearly. All these elements communicate something. Then we already talked about your posture, but very important is also the tone of your voice. Paralinguistics, this is called. It's not what you say, but how you say it. Your tone, your inflections, what you transmit through your voice apart from the words. All these are elements or categories of nonverbal communication. But these sort of categories, they're not perceived in a separate way. They send out a big sort of message about the person who's sending them. This is not a process that you necessarily have to use in an active way. You send out information all the time. You can just sit somewhere waiting for something, or having a coffee, looking at a newspaper, not doing anything fundamentally, and you still send out information. Now, where this becomes interesting for us conductors is when you start using this transmission in a conscious way. And also when we're analyzing what makes this type of transmission really effective or really convincing. In episode 11, when we talked about what makes you convincing on the podium, we looked at this congruence, when different type of signals point in the same direction. So, for example, if your words express something and then your gesture or your nonverbal communication reinforces that point, different types of communication going in the same direction creates conviction. Equally, on the contrary, for example, you find out that somebody is lying to you just because these minute things that go on in your eyes or in your face maybe don't reflect what this person says. And this incongruence makes you doubt the information you get. From this, we can draw certain conclusions. For example, the better the relation between you and the musicians is, the more effortless this communication will happen. There's no sort of misunderstandings or psychological fog in the middle. We can also understand that it's better to look at the musicians, because a lot of the communication goes through your eyes. And even if people don't look back at you, there's still something there that you perceive, because the face is the main contact and it's sort of the most instinctive point of communication. So make sure the musicians can see what's going on inside you. It also shows you how important mental preparation is, because if you're nervous or if you're angry or if you think about different things, it just makes this transmission of information much more difficult. It puts obstacles in between you and the musicians. People will mistake things. They think you're not really engaged, or they don't know really what's going on just because you're not there in the moment with them and free. Now, after analyzing the elements of nonverbal communication, maybe you look at your videos and you find out certain things that work or that don't work for you. The next question is, how can you practice? As this type of language is very universal, I think the best place to start is in everyday life. You have to learn to observe. On the street, in the bus, in a rehearsal, everywhere you see people and they give out information. Analyze this information and what creates what effect. And then you start using what you see. You have to start to act out. This has so many advantages, and one of the big ones is that true authenticity comes from you being really perceived as very, very natural. And this has to do with everyday life. I sometimes go to courses and I see people being very expressive when they talk, or very natural in their movements, and as soon as they step up on a box, they're totally unnatural. And you have to try and connect your conducting to the everyday person you are. Your gesture, your tone of voice, the way of illustrating things when you talk, of giving information out when you don't say anything. This is what will create authenticity, and that kind of communication will work. And then you start becoming this canvas for a piece. You can let the sounds and the musical insides of a piece travel through you and connect to the musicians. Working on your nonverbal communication also means that you have to practice, and you maybe have to let go of some things that you learned. Why do I say that? Because I think we all need more conducting and less instruction. Conducting is something different. It has something to do with conduction, something that flows through you. And instruction is very often related to words. It's something a bit academic. It doesn't really connect to the fundamentals of the music. It stays on the surface. And there we have to dig our communication hole deeper. We have to use this intrinsic connection that we have to others, going back to Darwin and to thousands and thousands of years of evolution. But this intrinsic language we have to share information together, this is where conducting really happens. This is really about emotion. It's a language we all have in common. If it's kids or amateurs or professional musicians, it's fundamentally everybody shares this frequency of communication. But as a conductor, you have to use this in a conscious way. You have to take people to places. You have to become transparent and inspire them to come with you and transcend their musical experience through the feelings and emotions that you communicate non-verbally when you're conducting. Thanks for listening. To send us your comments or suggestions, please write us a message on Instagram. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with all the conducting coaching news and events.